Starship breaks the curse with a successful 10th flight, India shows progress on its human spaceflight program, Firefly's Alpha is cleared to return to flight after its launch failure last April, and Rocket Lab celebrates the grand opening of its brand new launch site for Neutron. As always, we'll have all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. Okay, we'll get to Starship in a bit, but first there are some other methane-powered rockets that we need to talk about. Rocket Lab made quite a splash this week by opening a brand new launch pad in Virginia. The company's been launching its Electron rocket from there for a few years now, but this new pad will host Rocket Lab's forthcoming medium-lift rocket called Neutron. Neutron is set to become the largest rocket to ever launch from the spaceport, also known as the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport, or MARS. While Rocket Lab mainly positions Neutron as a launch vehicle for satellite constellations, it also opens up opportunities for other destinations such as Venus and Mars, the planet. Yeah, they really want to launch from Mars to Mars. And they might even launch crew at some point, which Rocket Lab seemed particularly keen to emphasize during the ceremony. To accommodate this much beefier launch vehicle, Rocket Lab installed a launch mount made from 700 tons of steel and copious amounts of concrete. CEO Peter Beck said that he wanted a beautiful launch site, and, well, it does look pretty good. But wait, how are they planning to install the rocket on the pad? Well, we're not sure. They might even use a crane to lift the rocket onto the launch mount. But this is only the first version of the launch pad, and Rocket Lab has already announced that they plan to upgrade it later with infrastructure for lifting and integrating the rocket. Moreover, they also plan to double the propellant storage and add more equipment to support rapid turnaround between tests and missions. Now that said, the current version of the pad should be enough to get Neutron tested and off the ground. So Rocket Lab organized a whole ceremony to open the pad, complete with a ribbon and a giant pair of scissors. But the true celebration was a test of the pad's water deluge system, which turned into a massive shower as the officials were cutting the ribbon. With the pad now open, Rocket Lab can start testing its Neutron rocket ahead of its first flight, which Virginia's Governor Glenn Youngkin stated would be before the end of this year. But will they make it? It seems ambitious. We haven't seen a completed Neutron first stage yet, and they'll first have to go through a test campaign with the rocket and the pad before they can even think of launching it. If all goes well, they might be able to do it, but from what we can see, it's far from guaranteed. We hope we're wrong though. And now onto a bigger methane-powered rocket. No, not Starship, New Glenn. Blue Origin has test-fired the second stage for New Glenn's third flight. Blue rolled out the second stage on a special transporter erector to New Glenn's launch pad at Launch Complex 36 at the Cape. Interestingly, shortly after it arrived there, the complex was struck by lightning. But according to CEO Dave Limp, the lightning towers did their job and protected the stage. Later in the week, our Space Coast live cameras captured a cloud emerging from the pad as the stage fired up for 15 seconds. Limp later shared footage of the successful static fire on social media and announced that the next New Glenn second stage with serial number 4 is underway. Now, the stage that fired this week was, as Limp confirmed, for New Glenn's third flight. Meanwhile, Blue's working on getting the rocket for the second flight ready, which is currently scheduled for no earlier than September 29th, though it seems that the flight might slip to later this fall. Believe it or not, there are even more methane-powered rockets to talk about. Nope, still not Starship. We'll get to it though, I promise. This week, United Launch Alliance went fishing for parts of its Vulcan rocket. Vulcan launched earlier this month on its third mission in a configuration with 4 solid rocket boosters that were dropped into the ocean after they burned out in flight. This week, a ship returned to Port Canaveral carrying the remains of one of these boosters, which ULA recovered for inspections. But why? Remember when one of the boosters lost its nozzle during Vulcan's second flight? Well, they've solved that problem, and while the performance on the latest mission confirmed that their solution worked, nothing beats having a look at the real hardware. So, ULA installed sonar pingers on the boosters to recover them for inspections. Although we've only seen one recovered booster, CEO Tori Bruno said on social media that they've retrieved all 4 boosters from the flight. Speaking of analyzing launch failures, Firefly revealed what went wrong on Alpha's last flight, which came just 3 seconds short of reaching orbit. If you watched the company's 6th launch, you might remember that something looked a bit off. Stage separation seemed more energetic than it should have been, and the footage from the second stage didn't show the engine's nozzle extension, which was clearly visible on the previous flight. This week, Firefly confirmed that the first stage did indeed explode a fraction of a second after stage separation, and the subsequent pressure wave knocked off the nozzle extension from the second stage. While it did recover, its thrust was degraded, so much so that it could no longer reach orbit. But how did that happen? Firefly found that the problem was ultimately caused by a phenomenon known as plume-induced flow separation, resulting from a higher angle of attack compared to previous missions. Plume-induced flow separation is caused by an aerodynamic process that creates a low-pressure area around the accelerating rocket, allowing the flames to creep up the rocket's side. Now, this also happens to other rockets, and it was particularly pronounced on the Saturn V, which is clearly engulfed in flames in some pictures, but dealt with it just fine. For Alpha, though, it caused excessive heating. Firefly believes that this weakened the vehicle to the point where it could no longer handle the stresses of stage separation, which then triggered the stage's demise. Fortunately, this problem is easily solved. Firefly will add more thermal protection on future flights and will also reduce the rocket's angle of attack during some phases of the missions. These solutions satisfied the Federal Aviation Administration, which has now granted the company permission to return to flight. We wish Firefly the best of luck with the next mission. After 3 failures in a row earlier this year and a ground explosion during testing in June, SpaceX's Starship finally broke the curse this week, achieving all the goals set for the rocket during its 10th test flight. Booster 16 and Ship 37 lifted off on August 26th at 23:30 UTC from Launch Pad 1 at SpaceX's Starbase launch site. The mission plan for Flight 10 was to carry out many of the goals and experiments that were never achieved on previous flights. The launch followed 2 previous scrubs on the 24th and 25th due to a liquid oxygen leak on the ship's quick disconnect arm and a violation of the Anvil Cloud weather rule, respectively. Much better weather on the 26th provided us with great views of Starship's flight, including an amazing vapor cone around the point of max Q. Booster 16's ascent went well, with the only mishap being that one of the Raptor engines in the middle ring of engines cut off early at around 90 seconds into flight. But with Super Heavy's engine out capability, this wasn't an issue, and everything continued as planned, with hot staging occurring about 2.5 minutes into flight. Super Heavy once again performed a controlled flip just like we saw on Flight 9 and performed its boost back burn. Booster 16's main goal during return was to simulate an off-nominal scenario during landing. It would ignite all 13 inner engines for landing as usual, and then disable one of the 3 center engines as if it were lost. At the same time, the booster would use one of the engines in the middle ring of 10 engines to serve as a backup to the disabled one. Booster 16 carried out all of this, even while missing one engine on the middle ring of 10 engines. The end of the landing burn also featured 2 of the 3 center engines lit as planned, and then cut off at a high altitude so the booster could drop into the water and explode into bits, unlike Booster 13, which landed in one piece, with parts of it staying floating in the water for several hours. Of course, the booster's return was more of a side experiment. After all, SpaceX has already demonstrated that it can not only return Super Heavy for a catch at the launch tower, but also reuse it. The bigger deal here was the ship, because after Flight 7, 8, and 9, plus Ship 36's ground explosion, all hopes were on Ship 37 to break the curse and actually perform as intended. Ship 37's ascent didn't seem to have any issues, and the vehicle completed it as planned. Unlike the previous flight with Ship 35, Ship 37 was able to maintain attitude control and reoriented itself for the first deployment test of Starlink simulators from its payload bay. This test also went well, with the payload bay door opening and all 8 Starlink simulators deploying from Starship's PEZ dispenser, the very first time that this mechanism was tested in flight. The 8 satellites were stacked in 4 pairs, with the mechanism first releasing the one closest to the door, and then the one in the back, before continuing on with the next pair. The ones on the front seemed to leave the payload bay nominally, while the ones in the back seemed to rotate a bit after deployment. We even saw one of them hitting the top of the payload bay opening on its way out. Now, this probably isn't a huge deal for at least 2 reasons. The first is that while these are mass simulators for real Starlinks, they probably don't have the same mass distribution rotation, something that would change the way in which they rotate as they're flung out from the dispenser. The second reason is that a small ding on the way out like that is probably nothing compared to what the Starlink satellites already go through when they're deployed from Falcon 9. During that process, there's no fancy dispenser. Instead, they're all piled up in one massive stack and are let go during deployment by releasing the retention rods. Once they start flying away, they all pretty much just bump into each other anyway, so they're built to survive low-speed impacts just like that. With the simulated satellites deployed, Ship 37 then prepared for the other test during its coast phase, the relight of one of its sea-level Raptor engines in space. This was a test that was successfully carried out by Ship 31 on Starship's 6th flight last year, but had yet to be performed on one of the Block 2 ships. Ship 37 was able to do the relight, ticking off another major milestone for Flight 10. The last, but certainly not least, important milestone was the test of the ship's re-entry. Now, this was the first time that a Block 2 ship reached this point while being in the right attitude, so it was also the first time that many of the new modifications to the heat shield were tested. This includes, for example, the relocation of the forward flaps further leeward and closer to the tip of the nose cone to prevent plasma from hitting directly on the gap between the flap and vehicle. Ship 37 demonstrated that indeed, this design change works, and the forward flaps were nowhere near as damaged as what we saw on the 3 successful re-entries of Block 1 vehicles back in 2024. The ship also tested a number of changes to the side of the vehicle that will eventually be used for ship catches. This includes the ship catch pins that survived Ship 37's re-entry. SpaceX also added protective ramps on delicate parts of the side of the vehicle, tapered the edge of the heat shield with the leeward side, and installed ablative material beyond this heat shield edge to prevent damage to the steel in those areas. And all of this also worked during re-entry. Now, one rather interesting thing that occurred during this flight was the damage to the aft flaps. See, on those 3 successful re-entries of Block 1 vehicles that I mentioned earlier, they seem to not have had much damage to the aft flaps. Rather, the damage occurred on the forward flaps, hence the redesign for Block 2. But Ship 37's aft flaps had actually been damaged already, well before the thick of re-entry. For example, the starboard aft flap had visible damage, as seen from the ship's cameras at T+40 minutes, when the ship was still quite high up at 131 kilometers in altitude and nowhere near re-entry. Then at around T+47 minutes, when entry had just started, but still far from peak heating, a quite energetic event occurred on the skirt of the ship that damaged the bottom of the other aft flap. Now, this is interesting because it's in those areas where the ship's engine chill pipes are located. Before the engines are ignited, they're conditioned by flowing methane and oxygen through the fuel and oxidizer pumps. This creates gaseous oxygen and methane that have to be vented out in flight through those engine chill lines. On Block 1, they were located separately and further leeward on the skirt, but for Block 2, they were tucked into the aft flap aero covers. It wouldn't be surprising if this change in design is what led to that early damage of the bottom of the aft flaps, which of course got worse as the heat of re-entry started melting these places. Earlier in the flight, we can see oxidation marks on the bottom of the flaps. You can see them because there's a lot of discoloration in that area. These marks are likely from the venting of the oxygen through those engine chill pipes. Now, you might think that this could be from hot staging, but if we go to Flight 9's footage, we can see that this is a discoloration that's not present shortly after hot staging, but is there later in flight. Unfortunately, on Flight 10, they just didn't show the aft flaps until after SECO, so we gotta go by Flight 9's footage instead. The discoloration is also present on previous flights like Flight 6 with Ship 31. However, in that case, the discoloration is located further out from the vehicle, likely because on Block 1 ships, the engine chill line was further leeward and therefore further away from the flap. In the case of Ship 31, the aft flaps didn't suffer any damage like the ones on Ship 37 as a result of this discoloration, so this alone wouldn't explain the issue. In other words, there's something else going on here that's probably something that SpaceX will eventually figure out, as always. Thankfully, Ship 37's aft flaps endured the heat of re-entry quite well, despite that early damage, and were able to guide the vehicle down to the splashdown site. Ship 37 also carried out the planned stress test of these aft flaps later during its re-entry. About 66.5 minutes after launch, Ship 37 conducted its flip and landing burn and splashed down into the waters of the Indian Ocean right next to SpaceX's own buoy. After the flight, SpaceX released footage from the buoy and a drone that was placed in the area, which showed not just the landing itself, but also the state of the heat shield tiles after the re-entry. Yes, It's orange! The tiles are still there, but they were covered in a layer of orange material that makes them look like that. SpaceX was flying several different metallic tiles near the area where the orange patch starts, one of them which also had active cooling. Elon later confirmed that indeed, the orange was from some of those metallic tiles that oxidized and deposited their rust onto the rest of the tiles. He also said that the white near the nose cone is from the insulation where SpaceX deliberately removed the tiles. The landing footage also shows the damage on the port aft flap and skirt from the little explosion at T+47 minutes. It's amazing the ship was still able to make it down to the water in one piece after having gone through all of that. SpaceX also says the ship landed within 3 meters of the target spot, which is quite the precision given that it went about 2/3 around the world. Now the big question is what will happen on the next flight. Flight 11, which will also be the last flight of Block 2. With all the great data gathered on Flight 10, SpaceX will no doubt implement all of the lessons that they've learned from it into Flight 11, and we can't wait to watch. India is making progress with its human spaceflight program. Now you may remember that earlier this summer, an Indian astronaut, Shubhanshu Shukla, flew on the Axiom 4 mission to the International Space Station. While his flight was an important step for the country's space program, India's space ambitions go much further. In fact, the Indian Space Research Organization wants to fly its own crew capsule to its very own space station. This week, they showed off some progress towards this goal. ISRO's been working on its capsule called Gaganyaan for a long time, but it's finally getting somewhere. Just last month, ISRO completed thruster tests for the service module, which is the part of the spacecraft that provides power and propulsion, but doesn't go back to Earth. Or at least not in one piece. And this week, ISRO performed an important test with the part of the spacecraft that does make it through re-entry, the capsule itself. Specifically, they tested the parachute system by dropping a simulated crew module from a helicopter at an altitude of 3 kilometers to simulate a pad abort scenario. The nearly 5-ton capsule first deployed 2 small chutes that helped to separate the so-called apex cover. With that part gone, the 2 drogue chutes deployed for the initial slowdown. This was followed by 3 pilot chutes, which then helped to deploy the 3 25-meter main parachutes. It's an intricate process, but it all worked flawlessly, and the capsule splashed down safely. This was the first integrated airdrop test for Gaganyaan. Once all drop tests are completed, Gaganyaan is set to perform a few test flights to test its abort system in flight and in a pad abort scenario, followed by an uncrewed mission, and finally, India's first human spaceflight. Once operational, Gaganyaan will not only visit the ISS for a cargo resupply mission, but will also ferry crew and cargo to and from the country's own space station, known as the Bharatiya Antariksh Station, which is Hindi for Indian Space Station. And it's a good thing too, because it'd be pretty confusing to have 2 stations named ISS. It's a fully functional space station, though much smaller than the ISS, with a pressurized volume just over a quarter of the ISS. It's also smaller than China's Tiangong Space Station, which in its current configuration comes in at roughly a third of the ISS. At this week's National Space Day, ISRO showed off a full-scale model of the station's first module. It's roughly 8 meters long and has a diameter of 3.8 meters. India wants to launch the first module in 2028 and hopes to complete the station by 2035. Although it still has a very long way to go, this is definitely a very interesting program to keep an eye on. And if you want to follow along with Gaganyaan and other space programs, tune into future episodes. You know what to do. Like, subscribe, and perform all of the little YouTube rituals to ensure that you won't miss it. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, starting with Spanish company PLD Space, which is getting ready for some engine tests. PLD is working on a small-sat launcher called Miura 5, which is powered by the company's homegrown TEPREL-C engine. 5 of these power the rocket's first stage, and the second stage sports a version optimized for the vacuum of space. PLD has already been testing the engine's turbopump, which is powered by a gas generator. The open-cycle TEPREL-C engine runs on kerosene and liquid oxygen. This week, PLD showed off the first completed vacuum engine, which is now ready for its test campaign. Though this version will be used for testing, the company is already working on a V2, which will be ready by the end of the year. That version will actually fly and features a nozzle extension and some cooling features. The company plans to fly Miura 5 in 2026. CEO Raul Torres said on social media that the company hopes to have completed the first Miura 5 by December 15th. If they manage to hit that deadline, a flight next year certainly seems doable. In other news about small European rockets, the European Space Agency has awarded new contracts to Avio and Isar Aerospace. The companies will get to fly a few payloads under the Flight Ticket Initiative, which is a collaboration between ESA and the European Commission to allow European companies and institutions to test their products in space. Avio gets to fly the payloads as a rideshare on 3 Vega C flights launching from French Guiana. Vega C is the last variant of Europe's Vega rocket. It has only 5 flights under its belt, so it kind of counts as a new European launcher, which the Flight Ticket Initiative wants to stimulate. Vega C gets to launch a technology demonstrator for Spanish company Persei, which has developed a satellite deorbit system. It'll also launch a CubeSat for the German Aerospace Center DL that'll demonstrate a new avionics system, and the second satellite for an Earth observation constellation from the French company Grasp. Isar Spectrum is definitely a new rocket, as it's only launched once and didn't get that far, but ESA seems confident that it'll get there and awarded Isar 2 missions. Launching from Norway, Spectrum will carry a space debris cleanup demonstration mission for Infinite Orbits and 3 CubeSats for Dutch company Aerospace, which will host various experiments for other providers. Staying in Europe, the exploration company passed an important milestone for sending its Nix capsule to the ISS. Nix comes in different variants, starting with a cargo spacecraft, but ultimately, they want to bring humans to space stations and land a spacecraft on the moon. Before they do that, though, the company wants to ferry cargo to and from the ISS in 2028. The variant of Nix that will visit the ISS is 4 meters in diameter and 7 meters tall, including the service module, and is designed to carry 2,600 kilograms of pressurized payload. Additionally, Nix features an ablative heat shield to make it through re-entry, so it'll also be able to return some cargo. They've now passed the first of 3 stages of the ISS safety review, in which NASA and ESA confirmed that the design meets all of the hazard control requirements for visiting vehicles. Now, these are particularly stringent, as the station is a delicate spacecraft with humans on board, and a rogue spacecraft could put the station in danger. We don't want another Naoka incident. The Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency wants to collaborate with ESA to visit asteroid Apophis. Now, you might have heard about this asteroid before, as it'll fly by Earth in 2029. Now, don't worry, we are safe from the 375-meter asteroid, and we know for sure that it won't hit our planet, but it will get very close. Closer, in fact, than geostationary satellites. This close pass does all kinds of things to an asteroid, as the immense tidal forces from Earth's gravity squeeze it and stretch it. And ESA wants to see what happens from up close, and has designed the Ramses mission to visit the asteroid ahead of its flyby. The spacecraft will have to launch in 2028 to arrive in time, so to speed up the process, ESA based the spacecraft design on its Hera mission, which is currently on its way to Didymos and Dimorphos. The mission is still awaiting an important funding decision in November. JAXA wants to get in on the fun and has requested funding from the Japanese government to participate in the mission. They've already collaborated on Hera, providing the spacecraft's infrared imager, and for Ramses, JAXA will also provide an infrared imager as well as solar panels. What's more, Ramses will hitch a rideshare on Japan's H3 rocket for launch. Meanwhile, Japan's own ispace is busy working on its next-generation lunar lander. We followed along as the company launched the second mission of its Hakuto R lander early this year. Like the first attempt, they got really close but ultimately failed to touch down softly. For its next few missions, ispace will use its Apex 1.0 lander, which is developed by the company's US division and will fly under NASA's CLPS program as a collaboration with Draper. But for Mission 6, ispace wants to test a third lander design, the Series 3 lander. That mission won't fly for at least a couple of years, but the company's already working on the hardware. This week they showed off a structural thermal model, which is getting ready for thermal vacuum testing to simulate the conditions the lander will encounter in space. Hopefully the testing will pay off and will help this lander to touch down a bit more gently than its predecessors. This is your weekly space traffic report provided by Next Spaceflight. Aside from Starship this week, SpaceX also launched 5 different Falcon 9 missions, 3 of them for Starlink. Those 3 Starlink missions have now added 80 more satellites to the company's constellation, which is well past 7,000 active satellites in orbit. Starlink also announced this week that it now has over 7 million users worldwide, just 79 days after announcing they'd crossed the 6 million users mark. That's nearly 13,000 new users every day. One of the Starlink missions also made use of veteran booster B-1016 1967, which was flying for a 30th time, breaking once again the record for most flights of any Falcon booster. To mark this feat, SpaceX painted a crown above the booster's number before its launch. It also successfully recovered after launch, so I'm sure we'll see it again at some point soon. Of the other 2 Falcon 9 missions, one of them carried the CRS-33 Cargo Dragon mission to the International Space Station. This one was interesting because it carries a boost kit inside of Dragon's trunk. This kit will allow the spacecraft to carry out reboosts of the station during its 4-month stay at the orbiting laboratory, effectively replacing the duties of the Russian Progress spacecraft during this time. The other Falcon 9 mission of the week launched the Naus military reconnaissance satellite for Luxembourg into sun-synchronous orbit. Along for the ride were also satellites for Planet, Capella Space, Pixel, and Druva Space. As for the non-Falcon launches this week, we had the launch of a Changzheng 8A with another batch of 9 Guowang internet satellites from China. Rocket Lab also launched the 12th Electron mission of 2025, carrying 5 payloads into sun-synchronous orbit. The customer and payloads for this mission remained confidential, but we think one of them is the Lyra 2 satellite for EchoStar's Internet of Things constellation Lyra. Next weekend launches will be dominated by Falcon 9 and Starlink, with up to 5 different Starlink missions potentially taking place between now and our next space traffic report. One of those missions from Vandenberg will be making use of a brand new Falcon 9 booster, so that'll be a bit of a rare occurrence. But the much more interesting event next week might be in deep space. ESA's JUICE spacecraft is set to perform a flyby of Venus on August 31st. The spacecraft will use the planet's gravity to change its orbit so that it leads to an encounter with Earth next year in September, the second in a series of 3 flybys of Earth needed for it to arrive at Jupiter in 2031. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap This Week in Spaceflight.